this. By the way, he's not alone. We've got three others with Homer, right? The satirist follows him, Horace, Lucan last, and Ovid third. Each one of these writers, Horace, you'll remember Carpe Diem in our studies earlier, and Lucan the great poet and historian, and finally Ovid. Ovid's Metamorphoses is another really important text. By the way, what we're going to have here in this beginning of this listing, oh, there's so-and-so, and there's so-and-so, and there's so-and-so. Dante's not just name-dropping. What he's doing is he's telling us how he came to so many of the ideas he came to. We know, of course, his study of the Bible, no question. We know, of course, his study of Christian saints like Augustine and Aquinas. But there's a whole other host of writers, and we're going to see their names here now drop. He's not just name-dropping. What he's telling you is, these are the people that I know. By the way, if you're serious about the study of Dante, it would make sense that you would have read these writers, so that we can get some sense of exactly why. You'll remember that we said the same thing about Cicero when we were working with the Confessions. And in fact, you'll remember that St. Augustine said that one of the most important things he ever read was a text, unfortunately, we don't even possess today, a text by the great Roman writer Cicero. Okay? By the way, notice satirist is Horace, right? And we talk about Horatian satire. Remember when we did our Chaucer, we talked about Horatian satire, soft, gentle satire, Juvenalian satire from the great Roman writer Juvenal, nasty, biting satire, and the way that Chaucer used both, you'll remember, right? To continue, and Ovid third, that lone voice just now hailed me by a name. Each of them shares with me in such accord they honor me well. By the way, focus on the verb shares. The idea that Dante is making here is that texts share with texts. Writers share with writers. In other words, we are connecting new information to old information. I just want to point out that our learning theory is rooted in this idea, which is, of course, deeply Platonic, that the way you learn stuff is by connecting information to information you already know. And notice here, we all kind of share something in common, is what his point is, right? And so, Dante, the poet, says, I saw all come together there. The splendid school of the Lord of highest song, Homer. Again, this notion of we are the stories we tell, retell, accept, reject. Who, and now you're going to get an epic simile, Homer, like an eagle soars high above the others. Now, there's all kinds of irony here that, of course, we saw this eagle reference especially as it related to omens that were sent by Zeus in the Iliad. Of course, we saw it in the Odyssey as well. And then, of course, we saw it in the Aeneid. The eagle as a symbol is a compelling symbol for a number of reasons, but think about the fact that the eagle is the symbol of your country, America. Why an eagle? Teddy Roosevelt said we should have a bear, not an eagle, a scavenger bird. The answer, of course, in large measure is because these classic texts keep emphasizing the eagle is the greatest bird of them all. Wow, some of you will say, I guess I have to think about America's eagle, bald eagle now in a whole nother way. The eagle that soars high above the others, line 81. And they, after they had shared a word among themselves, in other words, they talked together with Dante the Pilgrim kind of standing off, they turned and greeted me with cordial gestures, at which my master smiled. So notice, we've got several times now the smiling, and we will remember, of course, Achilles smiling in the Iliad. We'll remember Odysseus smiling in the Odyssey. We will remember, of course, Aeneas smiling in the Aeneid. My master smiled, and far more honor. That fair company then made me one among them. So we traveled onward toward the light. I made a sixth amid such store of wisdom. Now, this is brilliant writing. Think about this. You have Dante the poet who has been exiled from Florence. And in exile, he writes a poem where he says that the great writers of all time, especially Homer and Virgil, I mean, think about the power of this, invited him to be a part of their entourage, and they had conversations as together. We strolled, speaking of matters I will not give breath, silence as fitting now as speech was there. In other words, I'm not going to tell you what we talked about, but what we enjoyed talking about, it was compelling. Now, let's go ahead and put this in our notes, because Virgil's Aeneid, Book 6, gave us this template of an idea that in the afterlife, some at least, in the afterlife, will enjoy conversations with those who came before. Of course, the most obvious example is Aeneas talking to his father Anchises. And this is given rise, of course, from the sixth book of the Aeneid. This gave rise to that idea that in heaven, or even here in limbo, you can have conversations with famous people. Right? That is to say, if you were to make a list of the people you'd love to talk to who have lived and died, what would that list look like? Well, and what would you talk about? Dante says, we had a great conversation, but I'm going to tell you what we talked about. Makes you always wonder, what was it that they talked about? Silence is as fitting as speech was there. At length, a noble castle blocked our path. Now all of a sudden we've got this castle. Lots and lots of debate among scholars about what this is. I'm always reminded of T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, making that reference from that biblical Proverbs passage, that the castle maybe represents the construction of the castle, the pillars of wisdom, the castle of great and worldly wisdom. That is to say, it might just represent philosophy or the attempts of the human intellect to try to construct the greatest works of intellectual art. A noble castle blocked our path, encircled 7 times by a barrier of lofty walls, notice the number 7, and defended round about it by a handsome stream. We strode across. It bore our weight like solid ground. Notice we've got Dante the pilgrim walking on water. Right? Okay, we're familiar with the idea that this is one of the great miracles of the Gospels, that Jesus Christ walked on water. Notice here we got walking on water. And after that I passed through 7 gateways with the sages. Now, of course, this word sages, put it in your notes. It's an important word. Important teachers from an earlier time. It will remind us of the part 3 of Yeats's Sailing to Byzantium. Oh, sages standing in God's holy fire, as in a gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, Perninegyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. This word sages is a crucial word for us in the study of the classics, showing reverence, showing honor, and the like. We came to a fresh green meadow, which will remind us, of course, of the Elysian fields of Aeneid 6, right? Where we met a group of people with grave, deliberate gazes and manners of great authority. They spoke sparingly and in gentle, courtly voices. The first university, one of my students once said. The first AP classroom, another one of my students said. In other words, we come around and all of a sudden there's this meadow and there are all these people that are out there and they're just kind of sitting in groups and they're having conversations. Of course, we could say that for some of us, this ain't hell, this is actually heaven. To be able to sit and have great conversations forever, right? We drew aside to a place where we could look from a spacious, well-lit height and view them all. So in other words, we got the same thing happening in Aeneid 6, you'll remember, where they kind of sit and they look and they can kind of see everybody that's there. On that emerald green I saw, and take glory within me for having seen them still. The spirits of the great I saw, and now we're going to get the list, right? And I can't go into detail about all this just because of our lack of time, but I definitely recommend that you're looking at at Penske's the translation that we're working with, his endnotes and other kinds of work online. The first is Electra. Now, this is not the Electra of the Oresteia trilogy. This is the Electra that's going to give us ultimately Aeneas, okay? Electra I saw with many companions, among whom I knew well, which shades were these of Aeneas, and of Hector, and Caesar, this will be JC, who wore his armor falcon-eyed. I saw Camelia, you'll remember her, the great warriors from the Aeneid, and Penthesilea, the great Amazon warriors as well. And I saw King Latinus on the other side, and sitting by him his daughter Lavinia. So in other words, here we go. So Latinus and Lavinia are all there. It's interesting, some of my students have said, I don't get it, why wouldn't Latinus be among that group that were neutral and never could make up their mind? Because in the Aeneid, it kind of seems like he never can make up his mind. He's stuck in the middle. But here he is, right? I saw that Brutus. Now this is significant because we're going to end the Inferno with Brutus. This is, of course, a different Brutus. This is the Brutus in Roman history that actually, and of course this is why when we study Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, this is why the name Brutus is so significant, because Roman history has an earlier Brutus who, of course, is going to be one of the great killers of the nasty King Tarquin. Brutus, from whom Tarquin fled. And then we've got a whole bunch of others. Important women listed, right? Lucreta, Julia, Marcia, Cornelia, all important women. And sitting at a distance separately, I saw, lone, Saladin of Arabia. Now this Saladin, of course, is a remarkable inclusion. Many have been stunned that here we have Saladin, but later on in this poem, we're going to have the great prophet of Islam, Muhammad, in Dante's hell. Now, there's obviously theological reasons for this. This is a philosophic and as well a monarchical kind of understanding, a political rendering. Saladin, while fighting in the Crusades against Christians, was still understood to be a very honorable man, and so Dante's going to put him here. I raised my eyes a little, and there was he who was acknowledged master of those who know, sitting in a philosophic family, who look to him and do him honor. Now it's fascinating that Dante just assumes, we're going to see this in our study of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland later, Dante just assumes that you're going to know who this master of those who know are, or is. Well, it's Aristotle. What's fascinating is that Dante follows Aquinas, who said and taught that far more important than Socrates and Plato was the third of that holy trilogy, great trilogy of three important philosophic thinkers, Aristotle. And so here we have Aristotle, right, as the master of those who know, who look to him and do him honor. You'll remember, of course, our study of Aristotle specifically is his essay, Poetics. But go back to our lecture and remember that we said Aristotle is so significant for so many of the other things that he studied. The great integral mind of all integral minds, right? I mean, the guy worked on so many levels. I saw nearest him in the front, this won't shock you, Plato and Socrates. I saw Democritus, of course, the great thinker and orator, who strove to show that the world is chance. And then we've got several major philosophers mentioned, pre-Socratics, as we often call them. Zeno is going to be mentioned, then Empedocles, and then Anaxagoras, and then Thales, and Heraclitus, and Diogenes. All of these, of course, are important pre-Socratic influential thinkers. The collector of qualities of things in Dioscorides. These are doctors. We're going to get several doctors who will be mentioned. And we're going to get a poet who was a mythological poet, Orpheus. Of course, Orpheus is important because he will have gone into the underworld to try to save his girl. Cicero is going to be mentioned as a moralist. Linnaeus will be mentioned as a critiquer, an Arab critiquer of Aristotle. We've got the great thinker Seneca, another moralist, Roman moralist. Seneca the moralist. Euclid, the geometer. We know about Euclid from our study of math. Ptolemy is also mentioned, of course, so we have the great math minds, science minds. Hippocrates is also there, the great Hippocratic oath originator, the doctor. Galen is there, another doctor, of course, so especially of blood, the flow of blood. Avicenna, the great Arab critiquer of Aristotle. This is an important name. Some have argued the most important name of all of them. Why? Because it will be the Arabs who, in fact, provided Europe with Aristotle. He had been completely silenced, and then it was Avicenna, along with a few others, who will give us the translations. Averroes is also mentioned, so important, who discussed the philosopher in his great commentary. Yeah, there's no way, really, that you can have all of the stuff that we have of Aristotle through Aquinas without, interestingly, the great thinker, Averroes. Who discussed the philosopher in his great commentary. I saw so many, I cannot tally the list. Notice that so many, I had not thought death hadn't done so many, is now counterbalanced with, I saw so many of these amazing people. For my demanding theme so pulls my story. So hear that line again. I saw so many, I cannot tally the list. For my demanding theme so pulls my story. In other words, I wish I could stay here and just tell you about all the people that I saw. To multiply the telling would be too little for the multitude of fact that filled my journey. In other words, I have lots more stories where these came from. I just can't tell you all the stories of all the people who I met. And then to finish the canto, the company of six divide, in other words, he as well as Virgil, and then those other four writers, and dwindle to two. My wise guide leads me from that quiet another way. Again, I see air tremble, which is a really interesting idea, and come to a part that has no light inside it. Again, notice, we go from darkness to light to darkness again. Of course, here, important, we see who Dante's intellectual antecedents are. Who made you what you are? There's a line in Tennyson's Ulysses that we will study later. I am part of all that I have met. And yet all is an arch wherethrough, all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that much untraveled worlds whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. In other words, we're constructed by everything that we are. Remember in your junior year when we did Walt Whitman, there was a child went forth. Every day he saw something and it became a part of him and he became a part of that. The same argument is being made here. All right, let's quickly jump to levels 2 and 3. 2a, major messages here. Well, greatness or fame, the quest to be remembered. The stories are the ways that we remember them. And some of the stories get told, and some of the stories for Dante, I just don't have time, he said, to share them all. Notice another message here. The goal for Dante, to be included as one of the great ones. And that, of course, is a significant moment for Dante, the poet, to say, I was included. It's also an interesting political twist that we'll get to in a moment. Finally, another message is, even greatness alone cannot provide salvation. I mean, think about this. Augustine and what he had to say about philosophy. Remember what he said? Philosophy can only take you so far, and then you have to have theology to finish the road. It can only point you, right, towards the ultimate goal. In other words, these thinkers kind of saw in advance what was coming. There's from the Fourth Eclogue, there's a famous passage that many medieval Christians quoted from Virgil, where he said that there was somebody coming great, and of course they backread it to say, well, he was speaking obviously about Jesus Christ. The notion for Augustine, as we said in our study, and what Dante says is, all of these influential thinkers, like Plato, for example, was forecasting what was coming specifically in the form of Jesus Christ in Christian theology. At level 2b, the symbolism, well, I mean, it's self-evident, isn't it? Virgil, Homer, Aristotle, all kind of symbolize fame and famous people, right? And they pointed in many ways the way to the Christian God of Dante. The irony, of course, is that even Aristotle and Virgil, they don't get to see heaven. They can walk on water, line 93, but they can't see heaven. And even the lowest Christian, think about this, the lowest nobody Christian will have an experience in the afterlife that Virgil can't have, or Aristotle can't have. There's a bit of irony. Obviously, there's a bit of irony to that one, right? Okay, we said we were going to look at Dante as poet, politician, and philosopher. Let's play that game now really quickly. As poet, well, notice, of course, he's included with the big five, right, which is kind of nice. We also, of course, have that epic list starting at line 100, which is going to make Dante look very much like Homer and Virgil. The politician side, we've already referenced it. He is really telling the Florentine people, really, you threw me out and you wouldn't let me come back, and I hang out with Homer and with Virgil. You think about that. It's a compelling political kind of little twist the knife. Finally, of course, the philosopher, Dante the philosopher, and that line 89 comes back. He spent his time speaking of matters that I will not give breath. Philosophers have the ability to discuss things that normally you can't share with other people. All of us who have read this canto have wondered, what was it that you would put those six people together? What was it that they would talk about? Would they talk about the past? Would they talk about the present? That is to say, Florentine politics and the state of poetry now. Or would they talk about the future? Finally, at 3a, well, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid all have, on some level, this cataloging, this listing. We're going to see this kind of thing. And, of course, it always seems to have something to do with fame, kleos, and, of course, we're playing the same game here, right? We can think about Augustine and the notion that philosophy can't save you. It can only point you in the direction. There are, of course, a lot of texts that in modern culture and postmodern culture that play this game. I mean, some of you even know that really old bad 80s movie, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures. So you say, dude, I love that movie. Think about what that film does. It plays basically the same game. In other words, it begs the question, and now let's ask it in 3b. If you could go back in time, who would you like to meet and talk with? There's this really interesting moment that Swift plays with, we'll get to him in Gulliver's Travels, where Swift is able to visit with Alexander the Great and have a conversation, or Socrates and have a conversation. It's all kind of predicated, of course, on Aeneid, Book 6, where Anchises is able to have that conversation with Aeneas. And, of course, here in Canto 4, especially when we will have Dante having a real conversation. He'll have conversations, but they're all kind of instructional and propedeutic, and there are people in hell who are trying to somehow defend the fact that they did whatever it is that they did. But here, the conversation is different. Why do you think, another question of 3b, why do you think we are so enamored of famous people? Like, what's up with that? right? So for example, I can ask you a time you met someone famous. Who was the most famous person you ever met? And why is it that that matters at all? Meaning, for example, a famous politician or a famous entertainer, a famous ball player. Like somebody will say, I got to shake the hands of LeBron James. Yeah, so? I mean, LeBron James is just a guy. I mean, he plays basketball, he's really great at it, but he's just a person. Like, what is our fascination? What is that? And of course, it comes back in some ways to the stories we tell and retell. That is to say, we tell these stories through our poems, through our texts, that celebrate certain kinds of people, and therefore to be attached with them some way makes us special as well. Dante the Pilgrim is able to feel special because he's included with Homer and Virgil. Makes sense. When was a time that you were included in a popular group? You were kind of the outsider. I mean, I had a student that said, this was like the first day I transferred into this school, first day I was here, and I could tell who the populars were, and one of those populars came over and invited me to sit down at lunch, and I wasn't sure if I should do it or not, because sitting down with them would make me associated with them, and here I was on my first day, and yet there was something inside of me that longed to be a part of that group for some reason. What is up with that? The student went on to say it was a mark of immaturity. I had to mature beyond it. What is up with that one, though? And then finally, who of this list that we were messing with do you still need to read? Of the people who we mentioned. For example, if you haven't read your Aristotle, you need to read your Aristotle, okay? And to make sure that you got some sense of what it is that's so celebratory about this guy. I notice I've mentioned a number of times Thomas Aquinas. I'm a firm believer that all of you should read Summa Theologica. Whether you're a practicing religious person or not does not matter, because his thought process was so influential in the history of the West, and I would argue the world. Well, that's Canto 4. Let's now turn to Canto 5. We're going to Circle 2. This is actually hell. So it's taken us, notice, 5 cantos before we actually get to real hell. And Minos will be here, and the carnal sinners, as they're sometimes called. That is to say, people who messed around hanky-panky. Okay, so we'll get to those, and we'll obviously have some conversation with Dante, the poet and pilgrim, about that. Thank you.